performed. And is very commonly performed wrong. And the reason why is that there are so many precautions that you have to take care of. There can be pitfalls in the machine or in the application. Let's start with the machine. Can I have the machine? The mercury sphygmomanometer is now still the standard tool. But I'm telling you that by the time you graduate, it's going to be out of hospital. Because mercury is being phased out from all healthcare facilities for fear of environmental intoxication. There will be no mercury sphygmomanometers. There will be no mercury thermometers. And since you are the ones who are going to practice in the coming decades, not me, you have to accustom yourself with this. The blood pressure is going to be measured digitally. And because it's going to be measured digitally, you may even reach a revolutionary stage where the millimeter mercury unit is no more used. Because the millimeter mercury is used here. But the system international for measuring blood pressure is the kilopascal. And you will find a time, maybe 10 years from now, where somebody is going to tell you that the patient's blood pressure is 15 over 10 kilopascal. And you have to know what that means. Again, caution, I will not be practicing. The cuff is a very easy problem. الدمور بتاعك عميل مش عارف اعمل ايه. I'm unable to. I have never been. The cuff contains a rubber bladder. When we talk about cuff size, we are talking about the rubber bladder size. We are not talking about this. This is cloth. This means nothing. The rubber bladder inside is this. The rubber bladder should be enough to surround 80% of the arm circumference. If it doesn't surround enough area from the arm, then the cuff is simply too small. And when the cuff is too small, it acts like a tire too small for a car. To support the car, you have to inflate it more than a tire which is big enough. So it's going to give you higher pressures. So don't use a small for arm cuff. That's one. Always when you buy a sphygmomanometer, make sure to have one standard cuff and one big cuff. If you don't have child's cuff, no problem, because if you use a bigger cuff than needed, there are no mistakes there. There will be no error. But if you use a smaller cuff than needed, you will have a higher cuff pressure. Second thing, the cuff has to be applied with its middle of the rubber bladder. The rubber bladder is from here to here. So the middle is here. Right? The middle of the rubber bladder has to be over the brachial pulse. So if my colleague's hand is here and I can feel his brachial pulse easily, now I can put this cuff surrounding and about 2 centimeters from the antecubital case. One important thing I want to tell you about. As you see, it has to be sitting because standing and supine blood pressures are not accurate. Feet has to be flat on the ground. Sitting with one leg over the other gives you a higher reading. Always remember that sitting with one leg over the other is an isometric exercise. His back has to be supported on the back of the chair. And his arm has to be supported on a desk. So always remember the common word we use, feet supported, back supported, arm supported. Always. Cuff suitable to arm size. not use a larger cuff. Don't try to use an ordinary cuff in a larger cloth just to surround the arm. That's rubbish. That's not going to work. You have to buy two cuffs. If you buy a stigma, you have to buy two cuffs. Don't buy it without a large arm, unless you are 100% sure that your country has no obesity. Of course, this is a different story. But I'm assuring you that maybe half the patients at cardiologists will see are going to be obese. The second question, or let us say the second point of error, can be this thing. This machine is a very deceiving machine. Looks like a simple manometer, but if it's underfilled with mercury, then when you put it on a horizontal space, you don't see the upper surface at the zero level. You find it deep inside, sunk in. If that is the case, then you are not starting from zero, you are starting from sub-zero, and so you don't know what's the meaning of the figure. One bad thing, if the reservoir is underfilled with mercury and you start to inflate, air bubbles are going to come inside here. And you will find that the column of mercury is interrupted by columns of air, small columns of air. You don't know the weight of these, you don't know the meaning of this column, you don't know the column. So if the zero, the mercury is not on the zero, if the mercury is not on the zero, or if during inflation you see it bubbling, don't use the machine. Don't use it. Right away. Use an aneroid, don't use it. They say that this is the standard, but this can be full of errors. Full of errors. Okay. Now we will put this here, and if any one of you wants to come and see that the mercury meniscus is exactly at the zero. Now we will connect this to that. Then always remember to take blood pressure by palpation first. Always remember to take blood pressure by palpation first. Two reasons. One, the auscultatory gap. The auscultatory gap is a silent period after the start of Toropov sounds that can extend down to 60 millimeters per minute. So if you inflate to somewhere inside this silent gap, you will think that the systolic blood pressure is below it, and you will miss the systolic. This does not happen if you always take palpation. The auscultatory gap is more common. The auscultatory gap is more common in the elderly. And we used to think it is benign. As a matter of fact, it's associated with more vascular disease. It's those with atherosclerosis who have auscultatory gaps. That's why I always check by palpation first. By palpation, I can go up gradually, 70 millimeters mercury first. Then, and then go 10 at a time until the pulse disappears. And the pulse disappears at 130. This is called pulse occlusion pressure, POP. It's always important to measure. Then, we deflate, give the arm a minute to rest. Because if the venous engorgement in the arm increases with continued inflation of the cuff, the sounds are going to become more dumb. So don't let the arm be turgid with fluid. Leave the arm to rest for a minute. Then you start listening with the cone of the stethoscope over the brachial pulse. Over the brachial pulse. Sometimes, particularly people who are not as fit and nice as this gentleman, the arm is very obese, the pulse, brachial pulse, is very deep, and you cannot localize it accurately. The value of the cone of the stethoscope is that it gives you even the low frequency vibrations which are characteristic of the first phase of cough. But the value of the diaphragm is, if you are unable to localize the pulse, it has a wider range. If you are unable to put the cone exactly on the pulse, the diaphragm has a wider range of oscillation. I generally use the cone. What I'm going to do now, is the cone of the stethoscope over my cubics brachial pulse. Right? And then we go this way. Listen for is from the start of sound, no matter how weak, to the complete disappearance of sound. Not the muffling, not stage 4, stage 5. And this is one other thing I want you to dig out from the internet. It's going to be useful. Find cough sounds, and you will find a clip on the different websites with audio representation of the different stages of cough sounds. It starts first by a sound like tup, tup, tup. Then it becomes more crisp, tup, tup. And then it becomes a sound followed by a little murmur effect, tush, tush. And then it starts to go faint. And then it disappears. So it's just like this. Tup, tup, tush, tush. And it goes. You see? You can easily download an audio clip on it. If you just write in Google cough sounds video, for example, it will give you a lot of recordings that can be very useful. So now you can take Wells rule, pulmonary embolism, Wells rule, deep vein thrombosis, and cough sounds. Okay? There are certain situations where the distance between stage 4 cough and stage 5, the complete disappearance, is very long. This can happen in pregnant women, and it can happen in aortic regurgitation. If you find that the difference between stage 4 and stage 5 is very big, like 50, 60 millimeters of mercury, it's advisable to write down the. So I would say systolic blood pressure of a pregnant lady is 120 over 80-60 or 80-50, for example. So you can use that if you want to compare. Particularly, if the blood pressure of a lady during pregnancy is of particular importance, because suppose in late pregnancy she gets eclampsia or preeclampsia, you need to know what was her blood pressure before. So the more accurate readings you have, the more useful you are to the patient. One last thing I want to tell you about is that some patients, particularly the very, very obese people, whom you use a large cup, the cough sounds in general are very faint. And it is described there are certain maneuvers that you can use clinically, simple bedside maneuvers that you can use clinically to augment current pulse size, to enhance current pulse size. And I'm going to do these maneuvers with my colleague, though he is very nice and healthy, and his blood pressure is 110/70. He's in good health and hopefully he will get very much. But I'm going to just show you the maneuver. I usually need to do this in the obese arm with very weak pulses. What we do is this. Raise the arm above the level of air. So, you empty the blood from the arm. And then when you are raising the arm like that, now inflate. Put the arm down on the desk and ask the patient to open and close his fist several times. More. Now, muscle metabolites are going to cause maximal vasodilatation in this arm. Okay? Enough. Now, do the blood pressure. Find that the sounds are appreciably stronger, louder. So, thank you very much. So, there are maneuvers that we use to augment the cough sounds if we are unable to hear the start and finish of the sounds clearly in a particular case. Few points have to be taken into account now. One, what about the patient with irregular pulse, like atrial fibrillation? In this situation, the safest way is to take the average of more readings. So usually you measure 2 times because 1 time is wrong, generally. 1 time is just flatly wrong. If you usually measure 2 times and I have a patient with atrial fibrillation, I take the average of 4 times. This is the safest way. Remember 2 other things. Patients who have profound severe bradycardia, like complete heart block, can have a false high blood pressure. So you don't judge the blood pressure and treat it in a patient with complete heart block. Also remember that a very high blood pressure in a patient with aortic regurgitation does not mean hypertension. It's part of aortic regurgitation. So, take notice when you are measuring the blood pressure of 3 conditions, as I said. 1, bradycardia. 2, aortic regurgitation. 3, irregular pulse. Lastly, do you need to measure the standing blood pressure? And the answer is yes, in the following conditions. 1, in the elderly. Somebody above 70, you always, at least in the first visit, measure his standing blood pressure, in addition to the sitting. The elderly, very important. 2, the diabetic, for the chances of autonomic neuropathy and postural. And 3, very obviously, in somebody with postural symptoms. This doesn't need even me saying. The patient says if he stands, he becomes dizzy. You have to measure his blood pressure like he's standing. One point I want to tell you here is when somebody gets postural hypertension, you really don't see the hypertension immediately. The best way is to ask the patient to stand still for 2 minutes. And after 2 minutes, you measure his blood pressure. Because those who are going to develop postural hypertension 90% of them are going to do so within 2 minutes. The remaining 10% will need 1 more minute, but you don't have to wait 3 minutes. You see? So I measure the blood pressure and then take the average of my 2 readings. Then ask the patient to please stand up, still, 2 minutes, and then measure the blood pressure. The patient has postural symptoms, old age, or diabetes. So obviously you should do this in anybody who complains of symptoms. Just mention that, for example. Anybody who says he's dizzy when he's standing, you have to do that. Is there anything else I'm missing? Trying to remember. You diagnose postural hypotension if the patient gets symptoms with the standing that are associated with a drop of systolic blood pressure of about 20 millimeters. That's enough to diagnose. But if he gets a drop of 20 millimeters of mercury without symptoms, then you have to balance the situation. If, for example, he gets a profound drop like 40 millimeters of mercury, even without symptoms, this is severe postural hypotension. Do you measure the right arm or the left arm? In general, we measure the right arm. And the reason why is that most vascular occlusive disease occurs affecting the left subclavian, not the right subclavian. But, if you measure the blood pressure of the patient during the first visit and you find it equal in both arms, then it's okay to continue with either arm. It doesn't make sense. Questions? Questions?